The best students at Harvard gave up, then a black scholarship student raised her hand, and what happened next left the entire classroom in complete silence. Impossible. No undergraduate could solve this, declared Professor Williams, watching the empty room form before his eyes. One by one, the students in the prestigious Advanced Economic Theory class gathered his things and left the classroom. The task projected on the board was truly daunting: mathematically model the impact of racial inequality on American economic growth over the past 50 years, including social, political, and historical variables. Deadline: 72 hours. Reward: joint publication with a professor in an international journal. My father spent $200,000 so I wouldn't have to deal with this kind of thing, muttered Bradley Worthington IV, heir to a banking dynasty, as he pushed his chair back dismissively. Besides, who really cares about these social issues? Amanda Chun, daughter of Chinese diplomats and a straight-A student, shook her head. It's too risky. If we don't make it, it will destroy our GPA. It's not worth it. Within minutes, only 3 people remained in the 40-seat room. Professor Williams, clearly frustrated. The teaching assistant, busy organizing papers. And Keisha Johnson, 20, daughter of a cleaning lady at Detroit City Hospital, who had arrived at Harvard on a full scholarship for low-income students. Keisha looked at the complex problem on the board, her calloused hands, the result of summers working in her hometown's textile factory, firmly gripping the worn pencil she had brought from high school. While her classmates saw only impossible numbers, she saw her own life reflected in those equations. Professor Williams, her voice cut through the awkward silence of the nearly empty room. I'd like to try. The 55-year-old man, with 3 decades of experience teaching the children of the American elite, looked up with a mixture of surprise and something that seemed almost pity. Miss Johnson, I appreciate his enthusiasm, but this is a doctoral-level problem. Perhaps it would be better to focus on the basic subjects first. With all due respect, sir, you said that whoever could solve it would be guaranteed a publication. You didn't mention any restrictions. The silence stretched on for several long seconds. Professor Williams exchanged a meaningful glance with his assistant, one of those looks that Keisha had learned to recognize very well throughout her life. It was the same look she got when she entered expensive stores, when she applied for internships, when he dared to occupy spaces where people like her shouldn't be. Very well, he finally agreed, but there was something in his tone that sounded more like a cruel challenge than a real opportunity. 72 hours. No extensions, no excuses. As she copied down the parameters of the problem, Keisha noticed a detail that her classmates, in their rush to escape, had not noticed. There, hidden among the complex variables, was a subtle clue that completely changed the approach needed for the solution. What he didn't know was that this scholarship girl he underestimated had grown up living the very realities she now needed to model mathematically, and that would give her an advantage that no privilege could buy. If you are enjoying this story of overcoming adversity and want to find out how a student turned prejudice into her greatest strength, be sure to subscribe to the channel, because what happened over the next 3 days would forever change the way Harvard viewed the true meaning of academic excellence. In the next 24 hours, the news that the scholarship student had accepted the challenge spread across campus like wildfire. The WhatsApp groups of the wealthiest students were buzzing with cruel messages and bets on how long it would take Keisha to give up. $50, she won't even show up for class tomorrow, Bradley Worthington IV typed in the Harvard elite group, which brought together the children of the most influential families in the class. She's probably realized she's out of her league. Amanda Chin added, honestly, it's almost cruel to let her try. Professor Williams should have spared her the public humiliation. What they didn't know was that, at that very moment, Keisha was in the Central Library until 3 in the morning, not out of desperation, but following the same disciplined routine that had gotten her there in the first place. While his classmates slept in dorms paid for by trust funds, she worked with the precision of someone who always had to be 10 times better to get half the recognition. The subtle clue she had noticed on the board wouldn't leave her mind. Among the traditional economic variables, there was an almost invisible reference to community resilience factors, something any wealthy student would overlook, but which Keisha immediately recognized as the same survival mechanisms she had witnessed in her own community in Detroit. Mom always said that when things get tough, we don't break, we find a way, she murmured to herself, remembering the countless times she had watched her mother, Mrs. Shirley, turn impossible challenges into opportunities for growth. The next morning, Professor Williams entered the room with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He had spent the previous evening at a dinner with university donors, where the scholarship situation had been the subject of whispered conversations and muffled laughter. "Miss Johnson," her voice cut through the air with false cordiality. "I hope you've used these 24 hours to reflect on your academic limitations. There's still time to reconsider." "Thank you for your concern, Professor, but I intend to continue," Keisha replied, her firm voice contrasting with the nervous murmur that spread through the room. What followed was a masterclass in academic microaggressions. Throughout the class, Williams directed increasingly complex questions specifically at Keisha, always preceded by comments such as "perhaps this is too advanced for some educational backgrounds," or "public school students sometimes have difficulty with abstract concepts." Every sarcastic remark, every condescending look, every muffled laugh from her classmates was like fuel to the fire burning inside Keisha's chest. She thought of her mother working double shifts so she could have books, of the father she never knew but whose medical bills still drained the family's savings, of the countless no's she had heard throughout her life. During the break, Bradley approached her with a predatory smile. "Look, between us, why don't you just stop? You've already proven that he's brave. No one will think badly of him if he admits to having bitten off more than he can chew." "Really?" Keisha looked up from the notebook where she was taking notes. "And what exactly do you think he can't handle? Come on, be realistic. His grandfather was a partner at McKinsey. His father is the CEO of a multinational corporation. I grew up listening to these discussions at dinner. You're here on academic merit, of course, but that's different from understanding the real world of business." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Keisha's pen scribbling equations on paper. When she finally looked up, there was something in her eyes that made Bradley involuntarily take a step back. "Bradley, you're right about one thing. I grew up in a different world than his. A world where you can't afford to fail, where every opportunity could be your last, where you learn early on that underestimating someone is the most costly mistake you can make." That afternoon, alone in the computer lab, Keisha began to build something that neither her teachers nor her classmates could have imagined. The socioeconomic data she had collected over years of study, the personal stories of dozens of families in her community, the statistics she had memorized about racial inequality, all of it began to connect in a way that would transform not just numbers into a mathematical model, but lived reality into revolutionary scientific knowledge. What those privileged students couldn't see was that every act of contempt only fueled a determination that had been forged in furnaces much hotter than any Harvard classroom, and that true genius is born not only from intellect, but from the urgent need to prove that the world can be different from what it has always been. 48 hours had passed since Keisha had accepted the challenge, and the campus was abuzz with increasingly cruel rumors. WhatsApp groups overflowed with derogatory memes, bets on when she would finally understand his place, and jokes about affirmative action reaching its limit. What none of us knew was that, at that very moment, Keisha was in the basement of the Central Library at 5 in the morning, not because she was desperate, but because she had discovered something revolutionary. The clue about community resilience factors had opened the door to a completely new approach to the problem, one that none of his privileged colleagues could even imagine. "Keisha? Honey, are you okay?" Her mother Shirley's concerned voice echoed through the headset. It was her daily call at 5:30 a.m., before her double shift at the hospital. "I'm great, Mom. Actually, I think I've discovered something incredible." "Tell me." As she explained her theory to her mother, how community support networks in marginalized neighborhoods created patterns of economic resilience that traditional models completely ignored, Keisha felt the excitement grow in her voice. Mrs. Shirley, who had raised 5 children as a single mother while working 3 jobs, understood the mathematics of survival better than any PhD. "It reminds me of the 2008 recession," Ms. Shirley reflected. "While the banks were failing, our community organized in ways that television economists could never explain. You smart kids have always known how to find patterns where others see only chaos." That was exactly it. Keisha wasn't just solving a math problem. She was codifying decades of community wisdom into academic language that Harvard could finally understand. That morning, something unexpected happened. Professor James Wright from the Applied Sociology Department showed up at the library carrying 2 coffees and a genuine smile, the first Keisha had seen from a professor since arriving at Harvard. "I hear you're working on the Williams problem," he said, sliding a coffee toward her. "And before you ask, no, he didn't send me. In fact, I'm here against the explicit advice of several colleagues." Professor Wright was different. The son of Mexican immigrants, he had arrived at Harvard through the same inclusion programs that brought Keisha, but 15 years earlier, when prejudice was even more explicit. Can I take a look at what he's developing? Over the next 2 hours, Keisha presented her approach. Instead of following traditional econometric models that treated marginalized communities as statistical anomalies, her framework recognized these communities as laboratories of economic innovation, places where necessity forced the creation of solutions that mainstream academia systematically ignored. "My God," Professor Wright murmured, examining the equations. "You're not just solving the Williams problem. You're revolutionizing the way we measure socioeconomic resilience. Do you really think it can work?" "Keisha, I don't just think it can work. I think it will change the way this university views her community, forever." Meanwhile, in the elite student dormitory, Bradley was organizing what he called a farewell party for Keisha. "When she fails tomorrow, and she will fail, at least we'll have had fun watching," he posted in the Harvard elite group, sharing invitations to a celebration in the main hall. Amanda Chun, ever pragmatic, added, "Honestly, it will be a relief when this is all over. It's creating unnecessary tension in the class." The cruelest message came from Victoria Ashford, heir to a publishing dynasty. "Poor thing, she's probably in the library right now crying over her books. Someone should film it for posterity, the exact moment when reality meets the fantasy of equality." What they didn't know was that Keisha had access to all these messages. Not by accident or espionage, but because Jason Kim, a Korean-American computer engineering major who was also at the university on academic merit, had discreetly added her to the groups after noticing the pattern of deliberate social exclusion. "He really thinks you don't have access to any of this," Jason had told her 3 days earlier. "It's amazing how privilege makes people dumb to certain things." Now, reading every derogatory comment, every cruel joke, every handout about his impending failure, Keisha felt something that went far beyond personal motivation. It was as if every word of contempt was additional data for his mathematical model, more evidence that community resilience factors weren't just numbers in an equation, but survival strategies developed by generations of underestimated people. The night before the presentation, Professor Wright met with Keisha one last time. "Are you sure you want to do this? Not just solve the problem, but in the way you've planned?" "Professor, he spent 3 days treating me like I was a statistical anomaly. Tomorrow, I'm going to show them that the real anomaly is a system that has confused privilege with competence for so long that it has forgotten how to recognize true genius. What if it goes wrong? Then at least I will have failed trying something worthwhile." Keisha smiled, and there was something in that smile that made Professor Wright realize he was about to witness a historic moment. "But between us, Professor, I grew up in a place where failure was not an option. The genius they are about to see was forged in necessity, not comfort." When she left the library that night, Keisha carried not only the solution to the most complex problem the Harvard class had ever faced, but a plan that would forever change the way that institution viewed the true meaning of academic excellence. What those privileged students would discover in the next 24 hours was that underestimating someone who has spent his entire life being underestimated is the most costly mistake anyone can make, especially when that person has both the intellect and the motivation to rewrite all the rules of the game. The classroom was packed on the morning of the final presentation. Not only with students from the class, but with professors from other departments, some members of the administration, and even the dean of the School of Economics, who had happened to drop by to witness what everyone expected to be the spectacular failure of a scholarship student who didn't know his place. Bradley Worthington IV sat in the front row, his arrogant smile barely concealed as he typed on his cell phone. "Get the popcorn ready, folks. The show is about to begin," he posted in the Harvard elite group. Professor Williams entered the room with the posture of someone about to teach a life lesson. "Miss Johnson," his voice cut through the buzz, "I hope you've used these 72 hours well to find a dignified way to admit your limitations." "Thank you for your concern, Professor," Keisha replied, connecting her laptop to the projector. "But I think I've come up with something interesting." What appeared on the screen in the first few minutes wiped the smile off Williams' face. It wasn't just graphs and equations. It was a presentation that began with a quote from James Baldwin on the mathematics of oppression, followed by a methodology that transformed lived experiences into rigorous scientific data. "As you can see," Keisha began, her calm voice echoing through the silent room, "the problem wasn't impossible. It was just poorly formulated. You were trying to measure economic resilience using tools created by people who never had to be resilient." The following slides were devastating. Keisha hadn't just solved the problem. She had created an entirely new model that exposed the methodological flaws of decades of economic research on marginalized communities. Every graph, every equation, every statistical analysis was a direct blow to the academic arrogance that filled that room. "My God," Amanda Chin murmured, her usual confidence evaporating as she realized the mathematical genius being presented. She didn't just solve it. She revolutionized the entire approach. Professor Williams felt sweat trickling down his forehead. What he was seeing wasn't just a solution, it was work that could be published in the best international journals, the kind of research that defined academic careers. And it was being presented by someone he had treated as a statistical aberration for weeks. "Interesting in theory, Miss Johnson," he interrupted, trying to regain control. "But where are his primary sources? His empirical data? Anyone can make pretty models without." "I'm glad you asked, Professor." Keisha clicked to the next slide, and what appeared made several students shift uncomfortably in their seats. It was a graph showing correlations between institutional bias and academic productivity. "My empirical data came from a very close source. Jason, can you help me?" Jason Kim stood up, holding his open laptop. "Sure, Keisha. Guys, over the past 72 hours, you've provided fascinating behavioral data through his WhatsApp groups. Data on how prejudice affects decision-making, risk aversion, and the ability to recognize competence." The room went cold. Bradley desperately tried to reach for his cell phone, but Jason was already projecting screenshots of the Harvard elite group chats. $50 she won't even show up to class tomorrow, Jason read aloud. "She's probably realized she's out of her league. It's almost cruel to let her try." Each message read aloud was like a slap in the collective face of the room. Victoria Ashford sank into her chair, his face red with embarrassment as he heard his own cruel words exposed. "The interesting thing," Keisha continued, regaining control of the presentation, "is that you have provided the perfect data set to test his hypothesis about how privilege creates cognitive blind spots. Note the inverse correlation between demonstrated confidence and actual competence." Professor Williams was pale, realizing he had fallen into an intellectual trap from which there would be no escape. This is highly inappropriate. Using students' private conversations." "Private conversations?" Professor Wright's voice cut through the air as he entered the room, carrying a bulky briefcase. "Professor Williams, I would like you to explain why you thought it appropriate to discuss her performance at social dinners with university donors." The silence that followed was deafening. Williams knew he had been caught. His own words, repeated in exclusive social circles, had reached the wrong ears. Furthermore, Professor Wright continued, opening the briefcase, her research was simultaneously submitted to the Journal of Economic Behavior and the American Economic Review. Both publications have expressed preliminary interest in full review. Bradley Worthington IV attempted to discreetly rise to leave, but Keisha's voice froze him in his tracks. "Bradley, since you mentioned growing up listening to economic discussions at dinner, would you care to comment on the methodological implications of my intersectional approach?" He opened and closed his mouth like a fish out of water, completely exposed in her incompetence in the face of real work. "No." Keisha smiled gently. "No problem. Sometimes it's hard to recognize excellence when it comes from where you least expect it." The presentation continued for another 20 minutes, each slide a masterful demonstration of how to transform lived experience into rigorous scientific knowledge. When it ended, the silence in the room was absolute. Professor Williams, defeated and publicly humiliated, made one last desperate attempt. "Well, that's certainly creative, but we still need to consider whether—" "Professor," the dean's voice cut her off. "I'd like to speak with Miss Johnson privately. And with you, too. Now." As the room emptied in awkward silence, with students avoiding eye contact and leaving with their heads down, Keisha calmly gathered her materials. There was no triumphalism in his gestures, just the quiet dignity of someone who had proven a point he had always known to be true. Victoria Ashford paused at the door, turning back hesitantly. "Keisha, what I wrote was—" "It was honest," Keisha replied without malice. "And honesty is the first step toward real change. Thank you for giving me the data I needed." What those privileged students discovered that day was something that would forever change the way they viewed competence, merit, and the true meaning of the word qualified. But the most profound transformation was yet to come, when they realized that the humiliation they felt was nowhere near what Keisha had silently endured for months, and that true greatness is not measured by the cradle you are born into, but by how high you can rise from his. The meeting in the dean's office lasted 3 hours and forever changed the course of Harvard. Professor Williams left not only stripped of her prestigious position, but facing a formal investigation for discriminatory conduct and misuse of academic information in private social circles. Her words at exclusive dinners, repeated by guests shocked by her blatant prejudice, had become documentary evidence of a systematic pattern of discrimination. Effective immediately, Ms. Johnson will receive a full research scholarship, direct mentoring from me, and her presentation will be submitted as a joint university project to the National Economics Congress, announced the dean, his eyes shining with a kind of academic excitement he hadn't felt in years. In addition, we will implement a new inclusion protocol based on her methodological findings. 6 months later, Keisha walked down the same hallway where he had been systematically humiliated, but now as the dean's research assistant and lead author of a paper that was revolutionizing behavioral economics. The Journal of Economic Behavior had not only accepted her research, it had devoted an entire special issue to the implications of her intersectional methodology. Professor Wright, now promoted to director of the new Department of Applied Socioeconomic Studies, found Keisha organizing materials for his lecture at the international conference. "Have you seen the latest enrollment statistics?" he asked, holding up a report. "Applicants from marginalized communities are up 340% this year. Everyone wants to come to the university where it happened." It had become legendary in academic circles. The story of the scholarship student who turned systematic prejudice into rigorous scientific data was told in economics classrooms across the country as an example of how real genius trumps artificial privilege. Bradley Worthington IV, meanwhile, had been discreetly encouraged by her family's administration to transfer to a less rigorous European university after his family discovered that he was on the verge of failing 4 core subjects, the same ones that Keisha had mastered with top marks. His last Instagram post, 3 months ago, showed him at a third-rate private university, still trying to explain to his followers why Harvard wasn't the right choice for his entrepreneurial profile. Amanda Chun had a different but equally revealing fate. After witnessing Keisha's presentation, she sought out the young woman for a private and honest conversation. "I realize now that I spent 4 years here just memorizing formulas without ever questioning what they were for in real life," she admitted, his eyes filled with a humility that his millionaire parents had never taught her. Today, she worked as a volunteer for organizations that used economic modeling to combat inequality, a transformation that she herself described as the real education Harvard never gave me. Victoria Ashford had simply disappeared from social media, a complete virtual death for someone whose identity was built entirely on posts about inherited privilege. Rumors indicated that he was undergoing therapy at an expensive Swiss clinic, trying to cope with what psychologists called reverse imposter syndrome, the traumatic discovery that all of his self-esteem was based on achievements that were never really his. The most profound change, however, took place in the very structure of the university. The Keisha Protocol, as it had been informally dubbed by students, radically transformed the way Harvard evaluated both applicants and faculty. Questions about cultural fit were replaced by metrics of transformative potential. Traditional disciplines were restructured to include perspectives that had been systematically excluded for decades. Mrs. Shirley visited the campus for the first time to attend Keisha's graduation speech. Sitting in the front row, wearing the dress she had bought specifically for the occasion, she watched her daughter receive not only her summa cum laude degree, but 3 simultaneous offers: a full PhD at Harvard, a consulting position at the World Bank, and a proposal to lead a new research institute on economic equity funded by a coalition of international universities. "My daughter," she whispered, tears streaming freely down her face, "you haven't just exceeded all expectations. You've redefined what excellence means." At the graduation party, Professor Williams made a discreet appearance, not as a guest, but as a temporary cleaning employee, his new job after no reputable academic institution would hire him following the ethics investigation. A man who a year earlier had set the standards for academic adequacy now collected disposable cups under the gaze of colleagues who pretended not to recognize him. Keisha noticed him, but said nothing. There was no need. The best revenge is not to humiliate those who humiliated you, it is to build something so grand that his existence becomes irrelevant to her story. 2 years later, Dr. Keisha Johnson published his second book, Mathematizing Dignity: How to Transform Lived Experience into Scientific Knowledge, which would become required reading in economics and sociology courses around the world. Her TED Talks racked up millions of views, inspiring an entire generation of young scholars from marginalized communities. But the most significant transformation took place in Keisha herself. The shy young woman who had raised her hand in that nearly empty classroom was now sitting in his office at Stanford University, where he had accepted a professorship at age 24, becoming the youngest tenured professor in the institution's history, mentoring students who arrived with the same mix of pent-up genius and necessity-forged determination that she had once brought to Harvard. "Professor Johnson," said Marcus, a 19-year-old son of Salvadoran immigrants, hesitating at the office door. "Do you have a minute? I'd like to show you an idea I had about measuring community resilience in refugee populations." Keisha smiled, recognizing in his eyes the same intellectual hunger that had once been scorned and underestimated. "Of course, Marcus. And call me Keisha. After all, the best education happens when we eliminate the hierarchies that separate us from real knowledge." Keisha's story proved that true excellence is not born of privilege, but of the urgent need to transform the world into a more just place. She discovered that the best revenge against those who try to diminish you is not to destroy them, but to build something so extraordinary that her smallness becomes invisible in the face of her greatness. And if he's ever been in situations where he's been underestimated because of her background, color, or social class, remember, every time someone doubts her potential, he is unwittingly providing the fuel she needs to prove that genius has no color, class, or surname. She only has an insatiable thirst to transform imposed limitations into infinite opportunities. Subscribe to the channel for more stories that show how to turn prejudice into purpose and injustice into inspiration.